Well, good morning and welcome. It's really great to see a wonderful crowd this morning. My name is Jerry Weller. I'm a former member of the House of Representatives, and for the last several years I've been an advisor for the Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association as well as the Private Sector Coalition of Puerto Rico. And I particularly want to thank all our hosts this morning for the role that they are playing. Before I acknowledge them, I want to just give a little bit of housekeeping. We are broadcasting this presentation this morning on Facebook Live. If for those who would like to watch it at the same time they're listening here, they should go to IEFA, I-E-E-F-A, Cleveland on Facebook, and they would be able to watch this live streaming. And we're thankful to IEFA, who's one of our sponsors, for making that available for those who are unable to join us this morning. Also, I would like to point out that since this is being broadcast live, in order to be heard when you ask that really good question you want to ask this morning, we would have this cordless microphone, which we will pass around for that purpose. And so we ask that anyone on the panel, anyone who is speaking, and anyone who is asking a question, if you would use the microphone and speak into the microphone to ensure that you're heard by the audience via Facebook Live. Again, this panel today is a fairly simple question. How do we get the lights back on in Puerto Rico? As you know, today, 4 out of 5 residents of Puerto Rico, even though this is week 6 after Hurricane Maria, are without electricity. Imagine that. If you have a young family, you have elderly parents, you have a business, it's a problem. It's a challenge. The economy is flatlined, incredible hardship for 3.5 million U.S. citizens. So today's discussion is extremely important. Again, how do we get the lights back on and, frankly, do it the right way? This is an important forum, as I mentioned. I particularly want to thank the Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association, the Institute for Competitiveness and Sustainable Economy, the Center for New Economy, the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, the Smart Electric Power Alliance, and the Combined Heat and Power Association for their roles in serving as sponsors of today's important event. I also want to thank each of you for joining us. We have a full room today. The electricity system in Puerto Rico has been in the news in good ways and, frankly, much more in bad ways because it's a failed system today. And our discussion today will be, how do we get the lights back on, and how do we do it in the right way? I want to ask Jose Rossi, who is a past president of the Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association, to come up to make some remarks and introduce our first speaker this morning. By background, Jose Rossi is past president of the Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association. He's a businessman. He's a respected energy expert, and someone who every day is working in his leadership role of chairman of ICSE in order to bring about a better electricity system in Puerto Rico. So let's give a welcome to Jose Rossi.
Thanks, Jerry. Good morning. Good to see old friends from Puerto Rico here in Washington, D.C. with us here today. I have 3 important messages that have to do with our objective here today. Number 1, I'm proud to represent the will, the commitment, the monies of the private sector that have been put in place for years now so that we better the governance, the planning, and the execution of our electrical system. Obviously, we've not had much success to date, okay? But that doesn't mean important battles have been fought. We have to thank Centro Nueva Economía, funded by private sector Puerto Rico, so that we do have a strong, modern, regulatory framework legally in place prior to PROMESA, prior to Puerto Rico government bankruptcy that we can build on. Number 2, we have to thank Industriales, the Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association. It's their monies and their commitment to lobbying for the good of all sectors Puerto Rico, all consumers, so that we have a chance with PROMESA law and some of its existing language to enact change now without changing neither PROMESA law nor Puerto Rico laws in any significant manner. But we're also here today to thank some of the partners of the Institute that, along with that commitment and money and willingness, Puerto Rico private sector have been intervening, both Puerto Rico Energy Commission, at times Puerto Rico government, and our fiscal board now, so that they see the light in not just turning the lights back on quickly now, but also maintaining them sustainably with what now everybody understands will require a redesign of the grid. So again, I would encourage you to understand that we have great challenges in place right now. There's capital and there's private financing available at many levels, both residential, small businesses, big industry, that are waiting for a little bit of nudging on the rulemaking to start enacting change now. I hope that's part of the discussion today. We don't have to wait for a big redesign. On the other hand, if we don't redesign right, we will be wasting a tremendous opportunity. So nobody better to get us started on the subject than Professor Scott Hempling. He understands Puerto Rico regulations since they started barely 3 years ago in our territory, thanks to having that new legal framework. And I'm glad that you're here, Dr. Hempling, and can get us kicked off.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay in the back? And I had a handout. You may have to share. Who does not have a copy of my handout? Could you just raise your hand? Can we get some of the people who have adjacent copies and pass them over to the ones with the bad luck? I'm an advisor to the Puerto Rico Electric Commission, which was created after 70 years of no regulation of a vertically integrated government-owned monopoly. Again, 70 years of no regulation of a government-owned monopoly. We have started to create a regulatory infrastructure from scratch, and now its strength and necessity are going to be tested. The conversation I want to have, I'm going to take about 15 minutes to speak and then take 5 minutes of questions. First, I want to make sure we're all clear on the principles of economic regulation, because without those principles, there's going to be economic waste. Secondly, I want to make sure you understand the legal foundations under which the Regulatory Commission acts. We have all the authority we need right now, assuming it's not preempted by federal law, to straighten the situation out, to attract the capital, to protect the consumers, and to empower the consumers to act in the most efficient possible way. Thirdly, I want to describe to you the obstacles and uncertainties that face the regulatory system that the 2014 statute created, because without an understanding of those obstacles and uncertainties, you could underestimate the task that the Commission has before it. And lastly, I want to end on a positive note by describing some of the next steps that I think are essential to put the regulatory system in place, have it be accepted by all parties, so that money can flow in the direction that it needs to flow. So let me start with some very basic points. These are the principles that animate our Commission and that animate the very purpose of regulation. People who spend a career in regulation think that the purpose of regulation is recovering costs for the monopoly. It's not. The purpose of regulation is performance. The purpose of regulation is to produce results that are comparable to what effective competition would produce. And that purpose is the same whether we're regulating monopoly markets or whether we're trying to introduce competitive markets. And our Commission is responsible for doing both. What do we do when we want to induce performance? Commissions set standards. They assign consequences for failing to meet those standards or for meeting and exceeding those standards. By taking those steps, we achieve the purpose of regulation, which is to align self-interest with the public interest. That's why you have speed limits. That's why you have traffic lights, to align private behavior with the public interest. That's why we have a commission. That's why the 2014 Act was enacted. Now, what do effective regulators do at a time like this? What do they do continuously? They envision the products and services that best serve the customers. They then design and oversee the market structures that are most likely to produce that mix of products and services. Vision without action is useless. So it's the Commission's job to create a vision and then to implement it. And that is what we expect to do over the coming months and years. Another principle, economic efficiency comes first. It's better to spend time getting the pie big and then fighting over who gets what share than to fight over whether there's going to be a pie and end up with no pie at all. So economic efficiency comes first. It means we allocate costs to people who cause them. It means we allocate rewards to people who earn them. It means that politics doesn't determine the allocation of wealth. It means that merits determine the allocation of wealth. That's the same for regulation and for competition. Rewards and penalties must be based on merit, not on incumbency, not on political connections. Merit. And that's the job of the Commission, to determine merit. Thirdly, competition and privatization are not religions. Do I need to repeat that? Competition and privatization are not religions. Religion is based on beliefs and prayers. Competition is a market structure. A market structure is effectively competitive when it has many viable suppliers, many educated consumers, low barriers to entry. Competition is a market structure that, after taking 70 years of monopoly power, will take time and effort to introduce. Privatization is not a religion. It's a form of ownership that, like all forms, has benefits and detriments. And the Commission and people involved in this restructuring will be looking at privatization as well as government ownership. Thirdly, competition and regulation are not in conflict. That's a myth. The best sentence I've ever read in my 33 years in the business was written by Alfred Kahn in his great treatise, The Economics of Regulation, where he says it is the job, the continuing job, of legislators and regulators to find the best possible mix of inevitably imperfect regulation and inevitably imperfect competition. It's the best possible mix. It's not one versus the other. The two can be accommodated in any market sector that we set up. Together, what do competition and regulation do? They induce accountability. Accountability to consumers, to investors, and to the public. That's what I want to make sure we understand for that principle. Another principle, consumers are actors. They're not just victims. I keep hearing that we need to, quote, protect the consumer. I even heard that in the discussions over whether we should introduce competition, as if competition was something bad for consumers from which we have to protect them. Consumers are actors. They cause demand. Demand causes costs. Costs have to be paid for. So part of a regulatory system is to help consumers behave in the most efficient, ethical, legal, possibly way. That's what we mean by consumers being actors, not just victims. Now, when regulators make decisions, the next principle, what matters most are the facts. I spend a lot of time in regulation, and it's not just about Russia investigations where there are fake facts. There are plenty of CEOs and consumer advocates who walk in with adjectives and adverbs rather than facts and logic. And our Commission is focused on facts and logic. That's the basis for our decisions. Now, facts change. Economies of scale change because other things change. Cost structure changes. Technology changes. Customer preferences change. Production processes change. So effective regulation is all about accommodating those changes by recognizing them as facts that have to be addressed in the regulatory process. Second to last principle, the regulatory agency, if it's going to be effective, has to be expert and it has to be independent. A commission is not a supermarket. It's not a place where people shop for favors. It's an expert agency that makes decisions, as I said, based on facts and on logic. And to make those decisions, we need the expertise and the experience and the resources to acquire the facts, apply logic, and get the answers. We're not a supermarket. Let me turn to the second major area, and that is to make sure you all understand the regulatory framework put in place by the legislature in 2014. Again, this replaces a regime that for 70 years was a vertically integrated monopoly, free of competition, government-controlled. The main language that I've quoted here gives you a sense of the breadth and the depth of the Commission's authority. First, the Commission shall be an independent government entity in charge of regulating, overseeing, and ensuring compliance with the public policy on energy of the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. You know, I got the news this morning that the FOMB, the Federal Oversight Management Board, is going to federal court to get approval of its person to oversee PREPA. And in thinking about that, putting aside whether I think it's positive or negative, I personally think it's a positive development, but I don't speak for the Commission. But I was asked, well, what does this mean for the Commission's authority? And I said, I don't care if they put the Pope in charge. Act 57 gives authority to the Commission. Now, we'll find a way to work with FOMB, but PREPA is still PREPA, and PREPA under Act 57 is subject to the authority of the Commission, and none of that changes regardless of who is at the top of the heap at PREPA. So I look forward to working that out. Next, the Energy Commission is the key component for the faithful and transparent execution of energy reform. The Commission shall be able to guarantee the orderly and integrated development of our electrical system, shall evaluate the utility's plans regarding its obligation to efficiently generate power, shall oversee all types of operations, processes, and mandates, shall oversee the debt issues, shall approve the electricity rates, shall require that the prices in any agreement be just and reasonable, etc., shall guarantee that PREPA meets its obligations to bondholders. That's the essence of the Commission's authority. There's another 30 single-spaced pages of detail on it, but that's the basics of it. Let me tell you what we have done with the authority that has been granted to us so far, to make sure you have that background. First, major action that we did was something called the transition charge. This is frequently misunderstood. The bondholders in negotiations with the PREPA under the old government agreed to take a 15% haircut, to defer principal payments for 5 years and make other concessions, in return for which the Commission made sure that the dollars that it was willing to accept went directly to them and nowhere else. And so what we created was something called a transition charge, which basically moved dollars from customers' wallets directly to the bondholders without stopping off at PREPA along the way. It's a long order that's been examined by the bond markets and has been accepted as representing the Commission's promise that bondholders will be paid. Our first view was stabilize the financial community's understanding of the seriousness of regulation before we try to get fancy, and that's the first action we took. Secondly, we approved an integrated resource plan after a proceeding that involved a great deal of changes by PREPA. What we did there, I'm not going to give you all the detail. We approved the permitting and maintenance and retirements of certain fossil units. We approved certain investments and budgets in transmission and distribution. We required a detailed audit of all contracts for renewable energy. We required that PREPA create a competitive bidding process for all future contracts. Did you all hear that? A competitive bidding process for all future contracts. Approval of certain energy efficiency resources, and various findings, many of them negative, about PREPA's lack of compliance with our orders. And we approved what's called a modified IRP. I want to stress why that's important in the context that we're discussing right now. The PROMESA legislation says that a project that is inconsistent with an IRP approved by the Commission cannot go forward, even if the FOMB wants it. And so that was Congress's way of establishing that the gateway to investment in Puerto Rico with respect to major energy projects is a gateway at which stands the Commission that, as I have discussed with you today, focuses on facts and logic, not incumbency, not political connections. So we thank the Congress for making clear the Commission's gateway authority. I'll talk more before we stop about how we hope to exercise that authority. The third thing that we did was we issued a rate decision. I want to say this as clearly as I can. The consulting team, if you go look us all up, you'll find out that none of us really has a history of being hired by the investor-owned utility industry. Apologies to Eric from EEI. We've been friends for years. But the fact is, you couldn't find a group of 4 more clearly associated with objective regulation and consumer protective regulation than the consulting team. And we wrote an order, which the commission signed. They, of course, were part from the beginning, that granted nearly every single dollar that PREPA asked for in its rate case. This was not an easy decision for 3 commissioners to make, and it was not an easy recommendation for the consultants to make, but it was essential that PREPA get those dollars. Now, it wasn't a blank check. There's a whole series of conditions that I'll discuss momentarily, but I want you to know that the commission is committed to the financial solvency of PREPA and was willing to take the political hits that would be associated with that position. So that was the rate decision. I want you to look, though, at number 3.3.3, budget review to protect customers from unreasonable cost. Understand that when you're setting rates for a nonprofit utility, if the utility spends imprudently, what are you going to do? You can't disallow the costs because it's nonprofit. They need the dollars to cover their expenses. If it was an investor-owned utility and there's imprudent costs, Eric knows this, anybody in the room knows this, the regulator disallows the cost from rates, the shareholders take the hit, they get mad at management, and the right people get in place and things improve, you hope. But when it's a nonprofit utility, the commission doesn't have that kind of leverage. So what did we do in the rate case? It doesn't take a rocket scientist. We said, you get our approval of your budgets, you get your approval of our budgets before you spend the money. We won't micromanage, but we need to see the general parameters, we need to see the contracts, because once you spend the money, it's too late. So you get our budget approval first, you spend the money as you go, and that way we are doing the regulatory job of protecting customers from unreasonable cost. Guess who's appealing that order and that provision in particular in state court in Puerto Rico? PREPA. This is a company that received every dollar it asked for and didn't know how to say, thank you, we'll cooperate. That's one of the situations that we're dealing with right now that I want to make you understand. We have excellent lawyers handling it, and we think that the propositions that I set forth in Act 57 before give us the authority not to sit by and watch imprudent costs be incurred and then shrug our shoulders, but prevent them from being incurred ahead of time. Without that, I don't know where the regulatory leverage is. And so we will hope that the state court takes care of that, or we'll hope even further that the new leadership of PREPA withdraws that lawsuit. That's a conversation we hope to have in the coming days. I want to close, because I think I have about 2 minutes to go, with quickly describing some challenges that we have. Well, the first I just described, the difficulty of dealing with imprudent costs in a nonprofit context, which is especially difficult right now, given how quickly costs have to be incurred to get things up and running. The commission budgeting and hiring. Our commissioners, and I'm not going to get into Puerto Rico politics, I just got into Puerto Rico politics. I'm just going to be factual. The 3 commissioners originally appointed came from the prior administration. Our former chairman, Agustin Carbó, has retired. The 2 commissioners left, again, are not members of the party of the new administration. We have requests for budget. We have requests for hiring slots. We have all the normal requests that a commission needs in a normal situation, and they're not being acted upon, and that is somewhat difficult. We have received approval to do consulting contracts. We don't have approval for new hiring, and that's difficult and expensive. Next steps, very briefly. We need together to define the options in terms of resource mix, market structure mix, ownership mix. We have to define the criteria for choosing among the options. We have to think about static efficiency and dynamic efficiency, reliability, cost, customer choice. We have to get a grip on contracts. We can't have a situation where PREPA, citing an emergency, enters into a contract, whether it's a $300,000 public relations contract or whether it's a $300 million restructuring contract, without the commission having control over who gets it and how it's spent. Now, the commission is going to have to act quickly, but it cannot be left out of a situation where the public is understanding the risk of waste. We need to define a common view of the commission's role. We can't have FOMB saying that, not that they are saying it, saying that they will be in charge and there will be no regulation while the commission's issuing orders and not getting responses. I hope that's not going to happen. I think there is every reason to work out with FOMB their role and the Commission's role, preserving the Commonwealth statute and also preserving the intent of Congress. And so that's the close of my comments. And I don't know if there's time left for questions, but I thank you very much for your being here and for caring about Puerto Rico.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. We appreciate your panel, and I would ask the other panelists to come up and take their seats, and I would ask Hosen Rossi to return to introduce the panel. Of course, he's a panelist, so he can do that while he's taking his seat. Eric, you're going to introduce the panel.
All right. While our panelists are coming up, let me say at the beginning, I'm not with EEI anymore. I'm retired. I was for many years the Director of Alternative Regulation, which does give me a background in regulation. Speak into the microphone, thank you. But I want to be clear, I'm not representing EEI here today. If I make any comments during the course of our conversation, it's based on my experience in the industry, but I'm not speaking for EEI. And I also want to say, Scott, as somebody who comes from the industry, I'm very comfortable talking about the public interest. We relate to the public interest. We think we are servants. Utilities generally are servants of the public interest. So with that, let me begin, and we'll just go down the line. Tomas Torres is the executive director of ICSE. I have a relationship with ICSE. I've been working with Tomas most of the year. I'm sort of their Washington representative. Julia Ham is the president and chief executive officer of the Smart Energy Alliance, a very forward-looking trade association that has fully embraced the challenges of grid modernization, which is what we want to get to talking about, I think. Dale Loda, is the executive director of the CHP Association. Combined heat and power is an important industry for the conversation about redevelopment in Puerto Rico. We have a lot of CHP on site already because we have industrial customers. As I am always reminded that Puerto Rico as an island system is different from other island economies in that it has had a very robust manufacturing base. Half of their GDP, I don't know what the GDP is right now, I heard they're flatline, but recently half of their GDP was manufacturing. Most of our pharmaceutical manufacturers are in Puerto Rico, medical device. So they're different, and when we talk about redesigning the grid, we have to take that into account. Hosen Rossi is the former, as we learned, former president of the Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association. Tom Sanzillo, at the end, last but not least, is the director of finance for the Institute for Energy, Economics, and Financial Analysis, and has had an interesting career managing public finances. And so he has a lot of relevant experience also that we need to take advantage of. So with those introductions, my role as moderator is to watch the clock as we go through a set of prepared questions. And hopefully all of our panelists have seen these questions. I know I've discussed them with some. So I'm gonna read each question. They're designed to focus us on the issues and get us right to the heart of some of the challenges. And I will pose each question, and I will go down and let each panelist give them a few minutes to answer each question. And then we'll pause, and if there's a comment, if there's a rejoinder from the audience, or maybe a rejoinder from some other panelists, we'll take those. But my role is to watch the clock, so at a certain point I'll have to cut us off and we'll move on to the next question. So hopefully we'll have so much discussion that will be a challenge, and I invite you to participate. So the first question: can really the old PREPA debt, the debt that was incurred, we've already heard a little bit discussion, the incumbent utility PREPA before the storms was technically insolvent. They had more debt on their balance sheet than they had assets value. So they really have no credit standing. They have no ability to raise new financing. And so the question is, can that pre-storm debt be effectively decoupled from the redesign of the new system? And so let me start with that. Tomas.
Yes. First of all, thank you and good morning, everybody. To be here is our honor for all you to take time to be here. Just to put it into context, it's $10 billion per the federal bankruptcy court, a filing of PREPA in July 2nd, and yes, should be decoupled. And I will give you a brief explanation about that. It's a $10 billion debt, and the assets, pre-Maria, basically were estimated in $5 billion, capital assets. So debt to asset ratio is an outstanding 2 when you are supposed to be below 1 to be a solvent utility. So yes, that debt is on the way, should be removed, and in order to have the proper investment after the FEMA and the Engineer Corps restoration of the current system should be out of the way, so there can be a private investment. Now, very important, all need to happen, as Mr. Hemplin said, within a very stringent regulatory framework.
Okay, thank you. Julia?
Yes, Julia Ham, Smart Electric Power Alliance. Just to clarify, we actually are not a trade association. We're a 501c3 nonprofit, so we are not representing the interests of any one particular industry, but really looking to help everyone move through the transition that's happening in the electricity industry. So I think the only thing I would add to what Tomas has already said is that this is an opportunity to really think outside the box in terms of all options that could be on the table. And just one thought I had immediately was in terms of public-private partnerships. You know, what opportunities might exist that we can look at from other industries, other sectors that have done innovative things as we're looking, sort of putting the past behind us and looking forward, really using this as an opportunity to think creatively.
Dale?
CHP Association doesn't have a position on the debt restructuring, so I'll hold my time till next time and we can talk more about some of the solutions we have some thoughts about.
With regards to Puerto Rico Manufacturers Association and my personal opinion as well, 2 comments. I am personally I own Puerto Rico general obligation bonds. I am a bondholder involved in Puerto Rico debt. But on the other hand, I think President Trump is right on this point. The PREPA debt particularly needs to be wiped out. That doesn't mean that bondholders will be paid some after it's restructured, but it shouldn't be in the way of redesigning a new system and getting investors interested in Puerto Rico's opportunities to bring down cost. And again, I want to emphasize it. There's already in the approved IRP, Puerto Rico, 300 megawatts that are budgeted for CHP and distributed energy solutions industry. And there's budgeted renewable energy projects for more than that. And a lot of that can come out of just basic rulemaking to incentivize households, businesses, industry to invest now without waiting for a municipal debt resolution.
Okay, Toma.
First, thank you all for coming. And what Scott described, for those of you who do policy work here or analysis, is the dockets that he was involved in putting together create a body of information about PREPA that allows us to really move forward. The organization was not prepared to do so before that. So they've already made a major public service, created a major public service and an asset that should be used going forward. And the other thing is he said that the 4 consultants were very committed to objective standards. Let me put it this way. I'm a former comptroller for the state of New York, and I have to look at professional hearings and all like that for most of my career to look at them. I would take out their adherence to objective standards and say that was the best team I've ever seen of professionals trying to put together a very broken system. You will not find any better than Scott. And so Puerto Rico is very lucky to have had that. On the debt issue, that's what I did. I managed a $300 billion municipal bond market for the state of New York. So as a technical matter, you can decouple this. And you could conceivably, if Puerto Rico was wealthier, you could simply say the $9 billion debt is simply going to be we're going to switch it over to some new corporation, and there'll be new revenues. Just pay for it, and we're going to redesign the system. That's not going to happen because that level of revenue doesn't exist on Puerto Rico. The entire island has financial problems and distress. So technically, you could do it. But I think Jose put it correctly. The debt is probably worthless right now, although you'll see various kinds of market mechanisms to prop it up through gimmicks and all kinds of other things. And so what do you do in that instance? Well, you declare the losses. That first method would be a very sloppy and improper way of handling debt. This is a proper way of handling debt. That's worthless. You have insurance companies that have been paid premiums over the years for a certain amount of the debt. They should be required to make good on the insurance payments so that the investors don't lose their money. It's not all of the $9 billion or $10 billion, but it's a considerable part of that. The underwriting teams, there is an audit that was prepared that looked at how the underwriting teams, this is the lawyers, the underwriters, the credit agencies, the accountants, the financial advisors, all of whom allowed and participated in PREPA moving their debt levels to extraordinary levels that we would characterize in the bond market as a reckless use of the bond issuances over time. They need to be brought to bear and pay their part of it. There's precedent for it. SEC does it on several occasions. I would give you more if you'd like, and where the studies are and whatever. The third area, because this level of borrowing was so profoundly wrong, there probably needs to instill confidence back in Puerto Rico and discipline in the bond market. There probably needs to be criminal prosecutions or at least investigations that go, it's too big, you know. PREPA could afford maybe, it's debatable, maybe 30% of what they currently owe. Somebody borrowed way too much for way too long, and there was a lot of problems in doing that. Then there needs to be something set up for compensation. The large investors, I think they just get their haircuts and they'll get reimbursed some here. They're going to lose. You don't lend money to people who can't pay it back because they won't. Pretty simple. But there have been people, small investors on Puerto Rico who live there and who don't have big hedges like some of the large global funds or hedges like the hedge funds have. They just simply lose their retirement. To those people, that's the fraud to me. That's the fraud. And there needs to be some way to compensate them. It's a separate set of transactions than what I was just saying, but that's the way to appropriately handle public debt that has failed so miserably.
Tom, I'm going to cut you off there. I sense
I'm done.
you know a lot about this. You could talk quite a bit longer about this.
I tried to do it
We'd
real
like
quick.
to need to mine that experience. Let me move on, though. We have another question. We get off the debt. How can we best fast-track the revisioning for a new electrical system in Puerto Rico? The revisioning as a step. And let me before I turn it over to Tomas, I think we all anticipate that there's going to be a two-step process to redevelopment of the electric grid in Puerto Rico. The first step is this emergency response that we're in right now. The federal government is rebuilding the legacy transmission system. But that's not the grid that we need in Puerto Rico. I think there's a pretty strong consensus. We need a new modern grid. And what is a modern grid? So that's the starting point for this fast-tracking the process. What is it? How do we? What are the new features that we need in the grid? And then how do we get there? So with that, how do we fast-track the visioning process?
Thank you, Eric. Well, like propelling discussions like we're having here with people that know Puerto Rico things, live in Puerto Rico, and want to propose some ideas to to have a vision on how this should be. So let me have some facts. You mentioned about GDP. Puerto Rico GDP is fluctuated between 103, 105 billion. How doesn't it fit within the nation? Well, it's the number 37th GDP on the nation. And if you consider what is the manufacturing sector, which is half, actually it's about 48 billion, is number 18. So Puerto Rico's GDP manufacturing sector is number 18. So the vision of how to construct the system need to build around that. So how to build it? Well, there are industry, there are hospitals, there are big commercial centers. Those centers could produce their own energy. They can be renewable. They can have CHP. They can be the 51 state, as Julia is going to mention, I'm sure, just a few minutes ago. Well, we need to be resilient. Where I live, and I'm an engineer and a planner, we don't have any power, as right now about 80% at 5 weeks of the hurricane. And I need to stress this. I need to make a parenthesis. The mayor of San Juan, people are dying, statement is true. I have a personal loss in my family, but very close to me. And it's true, and many people had that. And so that needs to be addressed. And how to address that? Well, we can have De Lauda to encourage their partners to put CHP. We can have renewables. And need to be a resilient system. And again, well-regulated, and Mr. Hempling explained it, so we can all propel to a 21 smart system in Puerto Rico.
Okay, thank you.
So the question was how do we fast track this? And one of my favorite quotes is from a business authors, sometimes we have to go slow in order to go fast. And I think this is a great example. So Tomas mentioned ICSE-PR in the 51st state. So let me explain that a little bit. 3 years ago, we launched an initiative that had nothing to do with Puerto Rico. It had nothing to do with the District of Columbia, had nothing to do with this concept of statehood, but we called it the 51st State Initiative. And the initiative is focused on this idea of if you had a brand new 51st state that was a blank slate with no pre-existing electricity market design, rate structures, regulatory construct, compacts, how would people build the system in order to optimize the use of distributed energy resources together with all of the traditional resources that are available to us? So we've been running this initiative over the past 3 years, really bringing together thought leaders from across the electric power sector to talk about visions for what could be possible and roadmaps on how we get there. Now, unfortunately, we're sitting here today, while we did not design this initiative to be specific to Puerto Rico or anywhere else, seeing that Puerto Rico is about as close to this blank slate as we could possibly get in terms of the physical grid itself, in terms of the situation with the utility on the island, the fact that the regulatory body has only been in place for a couple of years, so there isn't decades of built up thought about this is how we do things, and therefore change is really hard. So Puerto Rico really is this amazing, unfortunate, but amazing example of this opportunity to start fresh and think about what could be possible. We believe that in order to do that, there needs to be a vision, but that vision needs to be created by the people in Puerto Rico. There are plenty of people in other places that have business interests in what happens there, but it should be the Puerto Ricans who come together through a very structured, thoughtful, facilitated stakeholder process that brings together all of the different interests on the island to talk about what the common vision is for the future of the island and its electric power. Once there's a common vision, then those stakeholders can talk about developing a roadmap on how you get from where we are today to fulfilling that vision. And it is going to take a long time to do that. We're talking about a multi-year process. But there needs to be a plan. That plan needs to be created by the people of Puerto Rico. So I think I'll stop there, but happy to talk more about that later.
Thank you. Dale.
Sunday will be 5 years since Hurricane Superstorm Sandy struck New York. Sunday is also supposed to be some severe storms in New York again. And it's an important anniversary because it's a great opportunity to highlight, in our case, for the CHP industry, one of the primary advantages that combined heat and power provides, which is keeping the lights on, keeping the products rolling out. And this happened in Superstorm Sandy. If you look at some of the photographs right after the storm of where the lights were on, pretty much where the lights were on, there was CHP. Where the lights weren't on, there wasn't CHP. Not 100%, but that's a pretty good guide. Similarly, in Puerto Rico, one of the main hospitals in San Juan was able to stay up and running, caring for patients, providing life-needed techniques because they had combined heat and power. What is combined heat and power? Still, probably most of you don't know what it is. It is a big machine, big or small machine that provides, just like it says, heat and power. The heat can also be cooled, so it's in one unit. You provide both the electricity and the heating and cooling. It's the newest old technology around. It's been around since Thomas Edison, but its time could be no more perfect than today. They come as small as this table to as big as this room. And they provide power in a variety of ways. The main ways I'll mention real quick is you could use combined heat and power unit along with an existing utility. That's something that happens in certain parts of the country now. It's an emerging use. The most common way you see combined heat and power, or often called cogeneration, used in the United States is to support a manufacturing facility. It also can support commercial facilities, as I mentioned, hospitals, hotels, things like this. Combined heat and power also is a crucial part of a smart grid, and that's what we're talking about here today, where along with solar and wind and other cleaner energy technologies, combined heat and power can provide the resilience and reliability that any grid needs, and used with these other technologies. And then finally, the fourth way is that CHP can be islanded, meaning it can, well, kind of an interesting time to use the term island in this island, but CHP can operate on its own. In other words, it doesn't need any wires, it doesn't need anything else at all. Just one CHP unit can provide the power and the heat and electricity that a facility needs. So it's a really cool technology, it's very exciting, and this opportunity in Puerto Rico is a great chance for us to help alleviate the current issues there. There's lots of oil coming into the country. The current grid hopefully will not be rebuilt because it clearly is fraught with difficulties. And we would like to help rebuild the grid in such a way that reflects some of these modern thoughts that we talked about earlier that frankly isn't necessarily even a grid as much as a new way to look at energy distribution.
Well, Mr. Lauro, I'm not looking for a job at CHP Association, but you should mention as well. We should mention that it can be the most efficient way of converting fuel to energy. It can approach 80% efficiencies when designed properly. The best central utility system, modern, when we finally modernize, will barely get up to 50% efficiency converting fuel to energy. So it's also the cleaner option.
Okay, thank you very much. Next.
Well, just a couple more comments. I have to agree that it's Puerto Rico stakeholders that need to take the lead, but we're going to need a lot of help, and we have to take into consideration bondholders, labor, and of course new investors, and the best way to do that transparently would be through Energy Commission proceedings. We also have to be cognizant that there are important obstacles to this happening transparently. I have my concerns regarding regulatory procedures being a little too slow. I don't know how that can be fixed in an environment where we have to move quickly and regain investor confidence as well as household confidence in Puerto Rico for people to stay in Puerto Rico and again invest in Puerto Rico. So I have my concerns regarding the regulatory processes, but it's the best way to ensure that redesign will consider everybody's interest, and that, as Mr. Hempling said, the final decision is based on facts and the best logic. Thirdly, it's I think our job, the ICSE's job, to convince FOMB, along with all of our investors and partners, U.S., that the best course of action is for them to follow the letter of the law promesa and work with the Energy Commission and negotiate just how quickly we can do this at the same time we use Puerto Rico legal power in addition to federal oversight in Puerto Rico.
Where Scott ended his commentary is, I think, where we are. There's sufficient body of information that doesn't require reworking. It's there. You just sort of build on it, and your next step is you have a sketch of an IRP that the commission has put forward. Now needs to be developed a little further, and then investment strategies moved upon so that the private sector can come in, see it, and begin bidding on it. You don't have to reinvent everything. This is not. I mean, the body of work that's been done is the basis upon which you can build the kind of grid system that we're talking about. You're not starting really from scratch. You're starting from many years of work by Tomas, Ozan, the other groups who have put together the regulatory system, by the people of Puerto Rico who have done this already. It's there. We have to use it and strengthen it. The opposition to it is coming from inside PREPA, and I'm going to just do this. I don't care anymore. Anyway, and inside the governor's office, and this is about some kind of old status quo self-interests that are being protected, and just like the PROMESA board trying to change that, we need to change it within the electricity system as well.
Okay, thank you. Before we move on, I'm going to take this opportunity to make a comment myself in relation to this question. First, I'd say pick up on what two of you have said in terms of let's not reinvent the wheel. We have some interesting models in the lower 48. You talked about CHP, the importance of CHP. We have in the U.S. Utility industry, the investor-owned utility, this concept of the public purpose microgrid, which is a mini system. It could well be built with a CHP as an anchor system that is designed to provide resilience and high reliability to critical first responder type facilities, police, fire, hospitals, groceries, gasoline stations. That is a very interesting model that Puerto Rico might well look at and think about. Can we enhance existing CHP applications to build them into microgrids to integrate renewable energy with them and design them to support the grid? That would, to me, be a very interesting, fruitful thing. The other point I would make about this is that the visioning, I think you didn't use the word public collaborative, but I think that's what we're talking about. A public collaborative in Puerto Rico is a very important first step to build consensus among consumers in Puerto Rico of all kinds about what they want, what they need. But the visioning is just the first step. Based on experience in other utilities in the mainland, that in a way, that's the easiest part of it. The harder part is having a multi-year planning process that can efficiently, because the issue in part is how to build this grid at a price we can afford, at a rate trajectory we can live with. So how to manage the process, how to target investments where they're needed. So there's more to it than just envisioning. But I'll stop making a speech and move on.
You had a couple of people who had hands up.
You want to make a comment? Okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Vadim Nicotine. I grew up in Puerto Rico. We own about 3 million square feet of real estate, so we know the pain of paying electrical bills for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
I agree with you wholeheartedly that PREPA is incompetent and the bondholder should not be paid a penny because they made the investment irresponsibly. That's my personal view, but one question that I have for you that in your opening remarks on this section, you talked about what do we do now to start rebuilding. FEMA is currently tasked and funded to start replacing the broken grid. Right. Per the Stafford Act, they have to rebuild exactly what was there. So unless we collectively ask for a waiver of that and ask them to start being intelligent about what they're rebuilding, we're just putting up a bunch of poles with a bunch of electrical wires that will fall the next time the wind blows. So I was a little bit surprised that no one addressed that. So could someone speak to that particular thing of our ability to redirect the billions of dollars that are coming to Puerto Rico in a more efficient way starting today?
I believe I can answer that. let me see without going out of the boundaries of this forum, but FEMA do have what is called mitigation, and within mitigation, they allow to correct what was deficiency built. So that can be addressed, and we had to have off-the-record conversation with people from FEMA, and that can be done and had been done on the past. I'm sure Tom, as former comptroller of New York, you can add to that. But yes, can be done, need to be done, and need to be decided and discussed. Right here we are in Congress. So that will be my take on your.
You had a second assignment. Anybody else want to
Well,
comment on this?
people need the polls up and the lines up as quickly as we can get them up.
Sure.
That's part of the solution, and I don't think FEMA right now is empowered legally to start the redesign, and they're not going to do the redesign, but there are portions of FEMA's legal powers that would allow hazard mitigation to bring in monies further than whatever PREPA is going to get from the insurance company.
So, and I would just add that, you know, the grid modernization is about adding new technologies and new functionalities to some kind of a legacy grid. So there will be a potential to make use of whatever FEMA restores on the way to a more modern grid. There may be an opportunity to just enhance what they do. So you had a question or a comment?
Thank you. Peter Baer with the Energy Wire, E&E News. Two questions. What is the size of the federal contribution, the appropriation, that's going to be required, in your view, to bring power back on in the short run and then to restructure the grid? What's the size of that federal capital investment, do you think? I have a second question.
Well, I believe I can take that. This is pre-Maria numbers because there is not a proper accountability of what will take to reconstruct the grid. But pre-Maria numbers, pre-hurricane numbers, per the proceeding of the Energy Commission for the IRP, the number for all the improvements required in generation, transmission, distribution was $5 billion. So it was pre-Maria. Now, post-Maria, with all the distribution that is on the floor and all the transmission grid, most probably that number has doubled or tripled.
And the second question is, should the commission oppose the Oversight Board's appointment of Noel Zamad as the overseer of the reconstruction of the grid? I've heard discussion about how you need to work with the Oversight Board on this, but should the commission go to court if it has to insist on its role in that process?
I would think the consensus opinion in the ICSE board would be no. They have the legal power to take charge of the PREPA mess, and the obligation now politically. Even yesterday, Tomas and I were having breakfast, and a tourist from Great Britain asked us about whitefish. So it's inevitable. I mean, the federal oversight is inevitable now politically, and it's necessary from the managerial standpoint because of incompetency, if not corruption, in PREPA, if that is your question. The question is who redesigns and how to best redesign. That's our real concern at this point.
Yeah, I mean, PROMESA is a fiscal body whose job it is to create a new fiscal balance within Puerto Rico, of which PREPA contributes. The Regulatory Commission is responsible for ensuring that that PREPA, or whatever its predecessor is going to be, run a well-run modern electrical system. So